A 7-year-old girl clutched her 10-month-old baby brother, kneeling on the front steps, tears streaming down her face as the suitcase and the baby's bottle were thrown onto the ground. Her stepmother and her lover shouted loudly, falsely accusing her of stealing a $1 bill. At that very moment, a millionaire appeared, standing frozen as he witnessed the scene, and he uttered only one sentence that left everyone in shock. Before we begin, please leave a comment about this story and give us a score from 1 to 10. Are you doing okay? If there is something you'd like to share, I am always here to listen. I hope you find a moment of reflection as you follow this story of healing, along with its journey of courage and justice. The Mitchell house still carried the faint scent of lilies and candle wax from the funeral that had just ended. 2 weeks had passed since John Mitchell, a successful businessman and father of 2 children, died suddenly from a heart attack. Yet the atmosphere inside the sprawling mansion on the outskirts of New York remained heavy, as if the funeral had taken place only yesterday. Grace Mitchell, a 7-year-old girl with large brown eyes, sat quietly on the long couch in the living room. In her arms was Noah, her 10-month-old baby brother. Noah had drifted off to sleep, his breathing steady, his cheeks flushed pink from the warmth of his sister's embrace. Grace clutched him tightly against her chest, as if she were protecting the last precious thing left in her world. Their mother had passed away on the very day Noah was born. The woman had given every ounce of her strength to save her child's life, but never had the chance to hold him in her arms. Grace remembered that bleak morning vividly, the hushed voices of adults whispering in the hallway, the sharp cries of Noah mingling with the broken sobs of her father. From that moment on, the once warm home became a place without a mother's touch, and Grace had to learn, far too soon, how to be a sister while carrying the first great loss of her life. Meanwhile, the sound of high heels clicked steadily across the wooden floor. It was Victoria Hayes, John's second wife. She was only in her mid-30s, tall, with neatly styled blonde hair. At the funeral, Victoria had worn a sleek black dress, her makeup perfectly applied, her smile practiced as she greeted the mourners. Anyone watching would have thought she was a devoted widow. But once the last guest had left, that smile vanished, replaced by a look of thinly veiled disdain. Victoria turned to the household staff, her shrill voice cutting through the silence. "Enough. Clear out all of his photographs. I don't want to see them anymore. This house belongs to me now." Grace flinched, her arms tightening protectively around Noah. She lifted her head, her voice trembling but firm. "Mom, Dad said this house belongs to me and Noah. He told me that before he—" She never finished the sentence. Victoria's eyes pierced into her like a blade. "Shut your mouth. What would a child like you know? If you want a roof over your head, you'd better keep quiet. Otherwise, don't blame me if you end up abandoned on the street." Grace bit her lip, tears streaming down her cheeks, yet she held her brother even closer. She was far too young to grasp the full weight of inheritance or legal rights, but she was old enough to feel that something meant for her and her brother was being stolen away. At that very moment, a woman's voice rose, steady and calm. It was Rebecca Lawson, John Mitchell's longtime attorney. Rebecca was in her 40s, her figure neat in a gray suit, her brown hair tied back in a low bun. She stepped out from the office, still holding a folder in her hands. "Mrs. Hayes, I need to make this perfectly clear. In his will, Mr. Mitchell left the entire estate to his 2 children. Your role is only that of guardian, but the condition is that you must care for them properly, under legal supervision." Victoria clenched her jaw, her eyes flashing with anger, yet she forced her voice to remain calm in front of Rebecca. "I know, Rebecca. I don't need you repeating it again and again." Rebecca's expression did not change. "I repeat it so you remember, because Grace's eyes tell me she does not feel safe in this house. And if that is true, then we will have to reevaluate your guardianship." Grace turned to look at Rebecca, her eyes shimmering with hope. For a brief moment, her small heart felt as though it had found an anchor. But just a second later, when she met Victoria's cold stare, she trembled and lowered her head. That gaze seemed to swallow up the fragile spark of hope that had just appeared. Not long after, when Rebecca left the house to prepare the next set of documents, the room was left with only Victoria, Grace, Noah, and a few servants standing quietly at a distance. Victoria crossed her arms, turning toward the man leaning against the doorframe, Thomas Green, her secret lover. Thomas wore a blue suit with a loose tie, his face rugged, yet his eyes sharp and filled with greed. Victoria glanced at Grace, who was holding Noah tightly, then lowered her voice, though still loud enough for the girl to hear. "You heard it. All it takes is the smallest excuse, and those two will be gone from this house. Forever." Thomas gave a dry laugh, his gaze sliding over Grace with contempt. "An excuse is easy enough. A 7-year-old girl rarely avoids mistakes. Just a little push, and no one would ever question it." Grace froze, clutching Noah tightly, her heart pounding wildly. She understood that what she had just heard was not an empty threat, and in that instant, fear surged through her, as though the sky above her was collapsing. That noon, sunlight streamed through the glass windows and fell across the polished wooden floor in the living room. The atmosphere seemed quiet, but beneath the surface, a cruel plan was slowly taking shape. Thomas Green sat leisurely in a leather armchair, a cigarette resting loosely between his fingers. His eyes wandered around the room, then he slowly pulled a leather wallet from his pocket, opened it, and took out a single $1 bill. He placed it on the gleaming wooden table. His fingertip brushed the edge of the bill as if weighing the next move in a game of chess. Thomas was the kind of man who had lived through enough to know how to disguise treachery behind a polished exterior. He had failed in business, debts piled high, and it was his relationship with Victoria Hayes that gave him the chance to cling to the Mitchell family fortune. He knew well that if he wanted to hold on to Victoria and the wealth, the first step was to get rid of the 2 children. Just then, Grace Mitchell came down the stairs carrying Noah. She wore a plain white dress, frayed at the hem, her face pale and tired from countless sleepless nights since her father's passing. On her small shoulder, Noah stirred faintly, his innocent little face unaware of the cruelty around him. Grace walked past the table and bent slightly to adjust the thin blanket covering Noah. That was the moment Thomas had been waiting for. With one swift move, he slipped the bill into Grace's pocket, leaned back, lit his cigarette, and exhaled smoke as if nothing had happened. A moment later, Thomas suddenly jumped up, slammed the table and shrieked, "Where's my wallet? Where's my $1?" The shout shattered the silence, making Grace flinch. Startled, she turned around, and Noah began to cry loudly. The sharp clatter of high heels echoed rapidly down the hallway. Victoria appeared, her lips painted a deep red, her eyes flashing as if she had been waiting for this chance. She marched straight to Grace, grabbed the girl by the shoulder, and screeched, "Stay right there. Let me see what this brat is hiding." Grace trembled, trying to turn and shield Noah, but Victoria's hand was already in the girl's pocket. The $1 bill glinted in the sunlight before falling to the floor. Victoria snatched it up, lifted it high, and cried out triumphantly, "Here it is, proof right before our eyes. A thief, and rotten to the core since childhood." Grace burst into tears, streams of sorrow running down her cheeks. She shook her head again and again, clutching Noah tightly to her chest, her voice breaking, "I didn't take it. I swear I didn't. I never even touched his wallet." Thomas stepped forward, a cold smile curling on his lips. He bent down, locking eyes with Grace. The cigarette smoke he blew out made the girl turn her face away. "Stop pretending to be innocent, Grace. Your kind-hearted father isn't here to protect you anymore. Now all you've got left are those thieving little hands." Victoria immediately flung open the front door. Daylight poured in, flooding the room with blinding brightness. She grabbed the small suitcase she had prepared earlier and hurled it onto the steps outside. The loud thud made Noah scream in terror. His milk bottle tumbled out and rolled across the stone courtyard. "Take that boy away right now," Victoria screamed, her face twisted with rage. "I'm not raising somebody else's child." Grace collapsed onto her knees on the steps, scrambling to pick up the baby bottle, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She clutched Noah tightly, tears spilling down onto her little brother's soft hair. "Mom, please, don't throw us out. I didn't do anything wrong." Victoria didn't even look at her. She crossed her arms and jerked her chin toward the door. "Get out. Leave right now. I don't want to see either of you for another second." From behind her, Thomas spoke with a bitter tone. "Victoria, it's just as well. Kids like her always end up being a burden. Now get out, before I call the cops." Grace's breath came in short, sharp gasps, her chest tightening. Every word they hurled at her cut like a blade, shredding the memory of her father, the man who had once promised to protect her for the rest of her life. Now, all that remained was rejection. Victoria lunged toward Grace, thrusting her finger into the little girl's face, her voice rising above Noah's cries. "You ungrateful brat! Get out of my house right now!" At that moment, a man's voice thundered from outside the gate, firm and commanding, freezing the air in the room. "That's enough." Everyone inside stopped cold. Victoria's hand froze midair, Thomas scowled, and Grace's tear-filled eyes widened as she turned toward the sound. At the iron gate stood a tall man in a simple brown suit, a leather briefcase in his hand. It was Daniel Carter, a 42-year-old businessman and longtime associate of John Mitchell. Daniel had always been discreet, rarely interfering in other people's family matters. But what he had just witnessed left him speechless. He saw a little girl, clutching her baby brother, trembling on her knees in the sunlight, while the very woman who should have protected them drove them out with cruelty. Daniel dropped his briefcase to the ground and strode forward, his voice low and heavy, filled with both anger and emotion. "What the hell do you think you're doing to these children?" Daniel Carter set his leather briefcase down on the tiled floor and strode through the iron gate. The sound of his shoes struck hard against the steps, each echo ringing in the stillness. He stopped at the doorway, his eyes scanning every face. First was Grace, her brown hair in a tangled mess, cheeks wet with tears, lips trembling as she held her little brother. Then Noah, his face flushed from crying too long, his tiny hand still clinging to his sister's shirt. And finally Victoria, standing upright with her hands on her hips, her cold gaze failing to hide her unease. Daniel's voice rumbled low, steady without shouting, yet it shook the whole house. "Victoria, what is this? How dare you throw children out into the street in broad daylight?" Victoria lifted her chin, her tone sharp. "You have no right to interfere, Daniel. This is my house. How I raise my children is none of your concern." Daniel stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the steps. His eyes burned with disappointment mixed with fury. "Your children? And this is how you treat them? Grace and Noah are the biological children of John Mitchell, a man who trusted me for 20 years. He once asked me to protect them if anything ever happened. Do not think you can keep mistreating them any longer." At the mention of John's name, Daniel's eyes flickered with emotion. In his memory, John had been a steadfast friend, a man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him through many difficult ventures. The promise to safeguard John's children had never left his mind, but Daniel had never imagined he would have to fulfill it so soon. Thomas Green finally spoke, his voice slow, laced with mockery. "Mr. Carter, I advise you to keep your distance. You have no idea what's been happening in this house. That girl just stole money right from the living room. A spoiled child needs discipline, not protection." He smirked, throwing a disdainful look at Grace, as if every word he said were unquestionable truth. Grace gasped for breath, clutching Noah tighter, her body trembling as she stepped back. But when Daniel bent down, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, something inside her heart eased. His voice rang clear, steady, carrying the weight of a promise. "Grace, I believe you. You don't have to be afraid." The little girl choked up, her shoulders shaking violently. For the first time since her father had died, there was an adult who stood up to protect her, not scolding her, not pushing her away. Tears poured down as Grace buried her face against Daniel's suit jacket, sobbing. "I didn't take anything, I swear." Daniel gently tightened his grip on her frail shoulders, his eyes sweeping toward Victoria and Thomas, his voice hard as steel. "You made this up just to humiliate a child. Do you even understand what you're doing? You are destroying her trust, destroying the last memories her parents left for her." Victoria tried to stay composed, but her tightly pressed lips trembled slightly. She snapped her head away and spat out through clenched teeth. "Don't play the hero here, Daniel. You know nothing about these children. They are not as obedient as you think." Thomas cut in, wearing a twisted smile. "That's right. You can fool yourself into believing she's innocent, but the truth is different. We only wanted to teach her a lesson. That's all." Daniel straightened, his eyes blazing, each word falling heavy like a hammer striking the floor. "A lesson? You call it a lesson to throw them out of their own home, to toss them onto the street, when their father has been gone for less than 2 weeks? Is that what you call teaching?" Grace heard every word, and a strange warmth rose in her heart. To her, each sentence from Daniel was like a protective wall. Noah had stopped crying. Only small hiccups remained, his wide, round eyes fixed on Daniel as if he sensed safety. Daniel bent down and lifted Noah into his arms. The baby was silent for a moment, then slowly rested his head on Daniel's shoulder. The tiny breath against the collar of his suit softened something inside him. A forgotten memory surged back when he was a boy. He too had been abandoned at the gates of an orphanage. No one had reached out for him then. That was why, looking at Noah and Grace now, he could not stay still. He turned to Victoria, his voice lower now, but sharper than any shout. "If you throw them out, I will take them with me, and this time, you will lose more than you think." As soon as the words fell, the whole house sank into a heavy silence. Grace lifted her tear-streaked eyes toward Daniel, while Victoria bit her lip, and Thomas froze. A new battle had just begun, and no one could predict where it would lead. The following afternoon, Daniel led Grace out of the building with quick, determined steps. He carried Noah in his arms, trying to shield the baby's innocent eyes from the prying looks of a few neighbors standing on their porches. They didn't say a word, but the headshakes and sidelong glances were enough for Grace to understand that the news had already begun to spread. Indeed, in just one night, the story of the missing dollar had swept across the neighborhood. People whispered it back and forth, and among all the voices, Evelyn Scott stood out the loudest. Evelyn, a woman in her 50s who lived only a few houses away from the Mitchells, was known for her nosiness. She was always by her window, watching the neighbors, never missing a scrap of gossip she could carry elsewhere. "That girl?" Evelyn whispered to a group of women sipping coffee outside a shop. "She looks sweet, but she can snatch money faster than lightning." I heard it straight from Victoria herself. The women chuckled, exchanging pitying looks as they nodded. As usual, the rumor grew more twisted with every retelling. At school, Grace felt the change immediately. Ever since her father's funeral, she had already become quieter, more withdrawn. But now, a few classmates avoided her, pretending to be busy whenever she came near. Whispers floated behind her back, making Grace bite her lip and clutch her notebook tightly to hide her trembling hands. Amid those stares, Karen Douglas, Grace's homeroom teacher, bent down beside her desk. Karen, a woman in her 30s with neatly tied red hair, carried both kindness and firmness in her gaze. She placed a hand on Grace's shoulder and spoke with gentle certainty. "I believe you, Grace. Don't let the words of adults break your pure heart. You don't need to prove anything. You just need to stay true to yourself." Grace looked up, her eyes glistening. A trace of relief appeared, because at least in that mess there was still someone besides Daniel who stood by her side. By evening, Daniel had taken Grace and Noah to stay temporarily in a small hotel near the city center. The room wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and quiet. He awkwardly set down the suitcase, then hurried to find a bottle. "Is it okay if I lay Noah down like this?" Daniel asked nervously, clearly not holding the baby properly. Grace let out a small laugh through the tears still lingering on her face. "You don't know how to carry him. Let me show you." Blushing, Daniel handed Noah to Grace. He tried mixing formula but didn't know how to shake the bottle right, spilling milk all over the table. Noah wailed, while Grace giggled, for the first time since her father had died. That short laugh made Daniel freeze. Warmth rose in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time, the sense that he had brought a little comfort to a child. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria and Thomas sat facing each other in the vast, now chilly living room. The yellow light cast sharp shadows over their tense faces. Thomas raked his fingers through his hair, snapping, "We were fools to drive them away. Without guardianship, the inheritance will never fall into our hands." Victoria folded her arms, her eyes sharp as blades. "You think I don't know that? I just wanted them out of my sight, but now things are different. We must get back guardianship. We don't need to love them, we just need their names under my custody on paper. When they're still children, they won't know a thing." Thomas nodded, but his expression remained tight. He knew the plan wouldn't be easy, not with Daniel in the way. That night, in the hotel room, Daniel leaned back on a chair, watching Grace soothe her baby brother to sleep. The lamp's warm glow softened her face, making her look both fragile and resilient. He thought of John, the old friend who had trusted him, and let out a long sigh. The phone on the table buzzed. Daniel picked it up. On the line was Rebecca Lawson, John's trusted lawyer, her voice more urgent than usual. "Daniel, I just reviewed John Mitchell's medical records. There are irregularities. I'm not convinced his death was natural." Daniel gripped the phone tightly, his heart pounding. In his mind, he knew this battle had just entered an entirely new chapter. Daniel left the hotel the next morning with hurried steps. He clutched tightly the stack of documents Rebecca had just handed him, feeling as though each sheet weighed heavier than stone. The glass doors of the law office came into view, and inside the lobby, Rebecca Lawson was already waiting, her expression tense. The middle-aged woman wore a dark suit, holding a thick envelope in her hand. When Daniel entered, she didn't waste words, only gestured for him to follow her upstairs. Once the door closed, Rebecca set the envelope down on the desk, her voice low and steady. "Here is a copy of the drug records. The results show that the heart medication John Mitchell was taking had been replaced. The pills inside the bottle were completely ineffective. Someone switched his medicine." Daniel froze, his hand trembling slightly on the stack of papers. In his mind, he saw John's eyes at that final party, the look of quiet pleading when his friend had whispered, "If anything happens, please watch over the children." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again, his gaze heavy with fury. "So they really did it," Daniel muttered, each word choking in his throat. Rebecca nodded, her voice firm. "I suspected it from the start, but now we have a clearer path of investigation. Daniel, if you choose to step into this, there will be no turning back." Daniel clenched his fist. He knew this wasn't only about justice for John. This was about the lives and the future of Grace and Noah. Meanwhile, at the Mitchell estate, the scene was completely different. Victoria stood in the middle of a crowded living room, wrapped in a striking red dress, her lips painted dark. Laughter echoed, wine glasses clinked, and flattering words filled the air. "Victoria truly is the perfect mother," one sycophantic guest said. "Managing the household, caring for both children, it's truly admirable." Victoria smiled and raised her glass, as if such words were undeniable truth. But in the corner of the room, Grace sat quietly with Noah in her arms. She held her baby brother close, her eyes fixed on the wooden floor. The noise of the party felt distant, belonging to a world that was not hers. Suddenly, a woman stepped forward. Anna Collins, the longtime neighbor of the Mitchell family, about 40 years old, her dark brown hair neatly tied back, her eyes warm. She handed Grace a clean handkerchief and whispered, "You're stronger than you think. Don't forget, Mr. Carter will not abandon you." Grace looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. Her voice cracked, reduced to a faint whisper. "I just want my dad to be alive." Anna could not hold back. She bent down and pulled Grace into her arms, holding her tightly. In that moment, the tears of two generations blended together, one mourning the loss of an old friend, the other longing for her father. As night fell, Daniel sat alone in his hotel room. The drug records lay open before him. His fingers turned page after page, reading each detail carefully, his heart growing heavier with every line. He knew this evidence was only the beginning. A knock sounded at the door. Rebecca entered, this time not only carrying a folder but also a thin envelope. She placed it in front of Daniel, her voice slow but sharp as a blade. "I just received the results from an independent analysis. Daniel, this is the most conclusive proof we can possibly hold." He opened the envelope and looked at the stamped paper inside. His chest tightened. Rebecca pronounced each word clearly, her eyes locked on Daniel. John Mitchell was murdered. That morning, Daniel stepped out of the car with Grace and Noah. He raised his hand to shield the harsh sunlight, then bent down to adjust the scarf on Grace's shoulders. The little girl clutched his hand tightly, while Noah slept in her arms, his head resting against her chest. The courthouse steps stretched out before them, and each step felt as if it weighed 100 pounds. Inside the small courtroom, tension filled the air. Victoria Hayes had arrived early, dressed in a bright red gown as if daring everyone to challenge her. Beside her, Thomas Green adjusted his tie, his eyes scanning the room with confidence. In front of them sat Laura Bennett, Victoria's personal attorney. Laura was in her early 40s, her blonde hair neatly tied back, her cold blue eyes piercing. She was well known in the legal community for her sharpness and her habit of crushing opponents with every question. Grace curled up in her seat, clutching Noah tightly. Her heart pounded, every beat echoing in her chest. Her innocent eyes, full of fear, flickered toward Victoria before quickly lowering to the floor. The judge entered, and the entire room rose to their feet. The sound of the gavel echoed, and the hearing officially began. Laura Bennett was the first to stand. Her voice rang out clearly, every word sharp as a blade. Your Honor, Grace Mitchell is a difficult child, one who has already stolen money from her own home. My client, Mrs. Victoria Hayes, has only tried to discipline her so that she grows up properly. Her intentions are nothing but educational. Grace opened her mouth to protest, but her throat tightened. No words came out, only the sound of her heavy breathing. Her small hand clutched the fabric of Noah's shirt as the baby stirred in his sleep. Daniel leaned close to her ear, his voice deep and steady. You don't have to say a word. I believe you. That sentence felt like a shield, blocking the wave of fear rising in Grace's chest. She looked up at Daniel, her eyes shining, and slowly nodded. Rebecca Lawson stood, holding a thick file. Her voice was clear and calm. These accusations are based on rumors, with no factual evidence. We have a report from the investigative agency confirming that the so-called incident of the missing dollar has no proof. It is nothing but hearsay, and hearsay cannot be used to destroy the life of a child. The courtroom stirred with whispers. Laura Bennett frowned, but maintained her confident posture. She glanced toward the back of the room, where another figure had just been called to the stand. It was Evelyn Scott, the gossiping neighbor who had spread the story across the neighborhood. Evelyn walked up nervously, twisting her hands, her eyes avoiding everyone's gaze. Mrs. Scott, the judge asked, did you see Grace Mitchell take the money with your own eyes? Evelyn swallowed hard, her voice trembling. I only repeated what I heard from Mrs. Hayes. The room erupted in murmurs again. Rebecca stepped forward, her voice sharp. So you never witnessed it yourself? Evelyn mumbled. No, I only repeated it. The judge frowned, his voice stern. Mrs. Scott, spreading unverified rumors can be considered slander. I strongly advise you to be cautious with your testimony. Evelyn lowered her head, unable to say another word. Grace sat in her seat, her shoulders trembling, but inside she felt lighter. For the first time, her breath came easier, no longer weighed down by injustice. Daniel placed his hand gently on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze, silently promising that he would always be by her side, no matter what. The judge struck the gavel, his deep voice echoing throughout the courtroom. This hearing is concluded. We will proceed to a full trial in the near future. The gavel struck 3 times, each blow crashing in Victoria's ears like a blade. She clenched her teeth, turned toward Thomas and whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "We have to act before this gets out of control." Thomas nodded slightly, the corner of his mouth curling into a cold smile. That afternoon after the hearing, the city sky was gray, wind rushing through the rows of trees in front of the courthouse. Thomas Green hurried along the sidewalk, his tie loosened, his steps rushed like a man on the run. He never looked back, but the tension on his face and the sweat on his brow betrayed his haunted state. Victoria stepped out a few minutes later, calling after him. "Thomas, wait for me." But Thomas did not stop. He only waved his hand dismissively and slipped into the crowded street. Later that evening, in a small bar on the outskirts of town, dim yellow lights glowed over old wooden tables. Thomas sat in the corner, silent, a bottle of whiskey already half empty. He poured again and again, gulping down each drink as if to drown the fear in his mind. Each time the glass emptied, he muttered, "She promised she would handle everything, and now I'm about to lose it all." The noise of the bar blurred around him. A few patrons glanced his way before looking away again. Everyone here was used to the sight of broken men drinking themselves numb. But in Thomas's bloodshot eyes, there was something more than alcohol. It was panic. The bar door swung open. A gust of night wind swept inside. A tall figure stepped in, his brown coat draped across broad shoulders. Daniel Carter. He didn't need long to find Thomas. He knew exactly which place Thomas would choose to hide. Daniel sat down across from him without a greeting. He tapped his fingers lightly on the table, his voice low but firm. "Do you think alcohol will help you escape from something?" Thomas lifted his head, his eyes red, letting out a bitter laugh. "Escape from fear, don't you get it? Victoria, she promised she'd take care of it all. But look around, it's falling apart. I have nothing left but this mud." He slammed the glass down on the table, his voice dropping, shaking. "I have evidence. Papers she hid. The time she asked me to get the medicine. If you want it for money, I'll tell you everything. If not, then both she and I go down together." Daniel stared straight at him, his gaze unwavering. "You think money will save you? What you need is not more dirty cash. What you need is a chance to start over, to live decently again. If you have even a shred of conscience left, tell the truth for those 2 children, not for money." Thomas went silent, his hand trembling around the glass. He looked down, torn, his eyes flashing with conflict. For a brief moment, it seemed he might break down and confess everything. But then, like a man terrified of the light, he shot up, his chair crashing back. "You don't understand. I can't," he stammered, before stumbling out into the night, his shadow swaying and vanishing in the dark. Daniel remained seated, thoughtful. He knew Thomas had begun to crack, and when an accomplice cracks, the truth is never far behind. That night, when Daniel returned to the hotel, Grace rushed out of her room, panic in her eyes. "Uncle, he's burning up. I don't know what to do." Noah won't stop crying. Daniel didn't waste a second. He scooped Noah into his arms, the boy's small body burning with fever, his breath rapid and shallow. Wrapping him in a blanket, Daniel ran to the car. The engine roared into the night, streetlights flashing by. Grace sat in the back seat, clutching his arm, whispering prayers. At the hospital, harsh lights scattered across white walls. Nurses rushed Noah straight into the emergency room. Daniel held Grace back, gripping her shoulders firmly to stop her from running after them. A doctor approached. Dr. Sarah Miller, in her 40s, brown hair neatly tied back, her figure stern but her eyes warm. She examined Noah quickly, then nodded to the nurses. "This child shows clear signs of malnutrition, doctor," Miller said, her voice steady. "He's frail. His immune system is weak. He must have been neglected for a long time. Thankfully, you brought him in on time." Grace sat in the hallway, her hands clenched so tightly her nails dug into her skin. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered through sobs, "If my dad were alive, none of this would be happening." Daniel sat beside her, placing his hand firmly and warmly on her shoulder. "I'll do what your father would have wanted," he said, his voice thick but resolute. "I promise." Grace turned toward him, her eyes red but glimmering with a faint light. She didn't speak, only nodded and leaned her head against his shoulder. Meanwhile, Thomas wandered aimlessly through the night, liquor blurring his senses. He stumbled into another bar, where loud music drowned out the pounding in his chest. Slumping at a table, he muttered incoherently, unaware that someone nearby was listening. Mark Davis, a young journalist just starting his career, was searching for a lead for the local paper. By chance, he recognized Thomas, his name tied to the scandals surrounding the Mitchell case. Mark listened carefully, the stench of alcohol strong, but the words spilling from Thomas made his blood run cold. Thomas slammed his hand on the table, his drunken voice slurred. "Victoria knows everything. She switched the medicine. She made John die." Mark's jaw dropped, his heartbeat racing. Quickly, he pulled out his phone, hit record, and asked, his voice shaking but steady, "Are you sure? Did you just say Victoria Hayes switched the medicine?" Thomas chuckled darkly, his eyes bloodshot. "Of course, I was there. She made me do it. I've got nothing left to lose." Mark tightened his grip on the phone, knowing he had just captured a fuse that could ignite an explosion across the city. That news, with just one more step, would burn like fire through a dry forest. The next morning, the city courthouse was packed. Reporters crowded the hallway, microphones raised, camera flashes going off non-stop. In their hands were copies of the morning paper with a bold headline, Accomplice confesses. Was Victoria Hayes involved in John Mitchell's death? Grace clutched Daniel's hand tightly. Noah pressed against his sister's chest, his eyes still heavy with fatigue after the fever. The constant stares made the little girl step back, her heart pounding fast. Daniel leaned down and whispered, "It's all right. You just need to walk beside me. Don't be afraid." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was so tense, it felt as if it could be cut into pieces. Victoria Hayes walked in wearing a striking red dress, her hair carefully styled, yet her eyes flickered uneasily at the sight of the press bench filled to capacity. The judge sat down and struck the gavel to open the session. His voice carried across the room. "Today, we will hear the testimony of a key witness." The name Thomas Green was called. He walked up to the stand, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He glanced at Victoria. Her gaze was sharp as a blade, but he swallowed hard and chose to speak. The judge's tone was stern. "Mr. Green, do you have any testimony regarding the death of John Mitchell?" Thomas trembled, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. A long silence stretched, then he burst out. "Victoria, she was the one who told me to switch the medication. I only followed orders." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Reporters snapped photo after photo, the flashes blinding. Victoria shot to her feet, shouting, "Lies! He just wants to drag me down with him. He was drunk. Nothing he says can be trusted." Laura Bennett, her personal attorney, jumped up to support her. "Your Honor, this witness is clearly unstable. His testimony is baseless and cannot be relied upon." Rebecca Lawson calmly rose and handed a file to the court. Her voice was firm, each word falling like the strike of a hammer. "These are the forensic results. The medication found in John Mitchell's body does not match what his doctor prescribed. It matches exactly with Thomas Green's testimony." The courtroom fell silent. A few spectators whispered, "My God, so he didn't die naturally." Victoria's fingers dug into the wooden armrest, her red painted nails leaving marks on the surface. The judge continued, "Attorney Bennett, the court has received a petition from the prosecution. They accuse you of accepting illegal payments from Victoria Hayes. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Laura froze, struggling to keep her composure, but Rebecca stepped forward, holding out another stack of papers. "Here is the transfer record. Mrs. Bennett's account received multiple payments from Mrs. Hayes at the exact times when important files were altered. I ask the court to take note." The clicking of cameras echoed once again. A young female reporter, Amy Rogers, swiftly took notes, her eyes glowing as the truth gradually came to light. For the first time, she had the chance to witness a historic trial. Laura forced herself to speak. I was only a lawyer being paid for my services." Rebecca cut her off. "Legal fees are never paid through hidden transfers like these." The judge frowned, striking his gavel to call for order. In the back row, Grace sat silently, holding Noah tightly. Every testimony, every piece of evidence pierced through her ears like tearing away a thick fog. For the first time, she realized that justice was not the distant dream her father once spoke of. Grace whispered, almost only to herself, "Dad, finally, they believe in the truth." Daniel leaned in, placing his hand gently on the girl's back, giving her a steady squeeze. His eyes were firm, like a silent promise. Across the room, Victoria was losing control. She leaned toward Thomas, her voice breaking. "Coward, you will die with me." Thomas kept his head down, his shoulders trembling. He didn't dare look back, yet in his eyes there was a glimmer of release, as if he were finally willing to admit the truth. The trial dragged on until late afternoon. When the judge's gavel struck one last time, his voice rang out clearly. "Tomorrow, the final verdict will be delivered." The courtroom felt suffocating. Reporters rushed outside, racing to break the story. Victoria sat frozen in her chair, her face pale. She turned toward Grace, her red lips pressed tightly together before curling into a faint, chilling smile. She leaned down and whispered through clenched teeth, only loud enough for Grace to hear, "That little girl will pay for everything." Grace flinched, her eyes widening, her arms trembling as she clutched Noah. Daniel saw it and instantly stepped in front of her, his gaze like steel. But the whisper had already burrowed deep into the girl's mind, like a looming darkness waiting to swallow her whole. The next morning, the city courthouse was packed. Not only were reporters crowding in, but also neighbors from around the block, parents of students, and even some people who had once known the Mitchell family. Everyone wanted to witness with their own eyes the final day of a case that had shaken the community. Grace sat in the front row, holding Noah tightly in her arms, her head slightly bowed. The sunlight streaming through the windows touched her small face, filled with both tension and hope. Daniel sat beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder like an anchor. Rebecca Lawson held the final case file in her hands, her expression calm but unwavering. Judge Edward Hill, a tall, slender man in his 50s with graying hair, entered the room. He was known for his sternness, but also for his fairness toward children. The sound of the gavel struck, and the courtroom fell silent. After many days of hearings based on the evidence and testimonies, his voice rang out firmly. The court declares Victoria Hayes and Thomas Green are guilty of involuntary manslaughter, as well as abuse of guardianship authority. A murmur rippled through the room. Several neighbors shook their heads in dismay. Evelyn Scott, the nosy neighbor who had spread damaging rumors, lowered her gaze to the floor. The judge continued, Attorney Laura Bennett, for unethical conduct in accepting bribes, is hereby stripped of her license to practice law. Laura sat frozen, her lips trembling, unable to believe that her career had crumbled to dust before her eyes. He then turned toward the audience, where Evelyn was seated. Mrs. Evelyn Scott, for spreading baseless rumors that harm the reputation of a child, the court orders you to issue a public apology to Grace Mitchell. Evelyn rose, her face flushed, her voice unsteady. Grace, I am sorry. I should not have spoken without knowing the truth. I was wrong. Grace lifted her head, her eyes brimming with tears. For the first time, she saw an adult admit their mistakes directly to her. But just as the judge prepared to conclude, Victoria suddenly shot to her feet. Her face twisted with rage, she screamed at the top of her lungs. You worthless brat! You ruined my life! She lunged toward Grace. In an instant, the entire room turned chaotic. But the two police officers on guard immediately stepped in, restraining Victoria. She struggled and screamed, All of this is her fault. That child. She ruined everything for me. Grace trembled, clutching Noah tightly in her arms as he looked around in confusion. Her little heart felt as if it might burst. But Daniel stepped forward, placing himself firmly in front of her. His voice rang out, deep and steady. No one touches this child again. Not ever. The courtroom fell silent. In that moment, Grace saw Daniel's broad back like a fortress shielding her. She broke down in tears, unable to hold back any longer. The tears poured down not only from fear, but because for the first time she felt truly safe. The judge struck the gavel hard, his voice sharp. Order! This trial is still in session. He looked directly at Daniel, then declared, As a longtime friend of John Mitchell, and as the man who has proven his ability to provide care, the official guardianship of Grace and Noah Mitchell is hereby granted to Daniel Carter. The decisive crack of the gavel echoed through the room. The words sounded like a bell of salvation. Grace buried her face into Daniel's shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably. Noah, exhausted after so many long days, had fallen asleep in his arms. Daniel held both children tightly, his eyes red but his gaze unwavering. In the hallway, reporters swarmed. Questions fired relentlessly. Mr. Carter, how do you feel about being granted guardianship? Grace, do you want to say anything? Will anyone be helping you raise the children? Daniel shielded Grace and gave a brief nod. I'll answer later. Right now, the children need peace. Rebecca stepped in, skillfully pushing the crowd aside, clearing a path for them to walk. Her eyes radiated protection, not only for the two children, but also for Daniel, the man who had just officially become a father. That afternoon, as they left the courthouse, the golden sunlight spilled across the steps. Grace slowly lifted her head, her eyes still wet with tears. She looked at Daniel, her voice trembling but clear. Are you really the one who will take care of us? Daniel bent down, wrapping both siblings in his arms and whispered, I don't make empty promises. I'll be here every single day until you grow up. Grace choked back tears, her tiny hand gripping his shirt tightly, as if letting go would make everything disappear. That night, in the quiet of the office, Rebecca was stacking files. Daniel stood by the window, the city lights casting their glow on his face. He stood in silence for a long time before walking toward her, his voice low but firm. "Rebecca, this is just the beginning. I have to learn how to be a father." Rebecca looked up, her gaze kind yet strong. "You will, Daniel, because you've already started from the heart." Outside, the city buzzed as always, but inside that room, a new journey had begun. The journey of a man learning to become a father, and of two children who, for the first time, could finally call a place home. The black car left the city center, heading straight toward the outskirts. In the back seat, Grace held Noah tightly in her arms, her eyes fixed on the window, where rows of trees stretched endlessly, as if opening a new path. The trial was over. Victoria and Thomas had paid the price, but for the little girl, things had not yet settled. Only when the car stopped did Grace see a small two-story house appear behind a white wooden fence. Daniel turned off the engine, stepped out, and opened the door for the two children. He didn't say much, just pointed with his hand. "This will be our home," Grace blinked, hesitant. "Really? A home? For me and Noah?" Daniel bent down, gently brushing her messy hair with his hand. "Not just for you two, for our whole family." Inside, the house was airy and warm. A small living room, a cream-colored sofa by the window, and on the table, a vase of fresh flowers that Anna Collins had brought earlier. A wooden staircase led to the second floor, where Daniel had prepared two separate rooms. Grace ran up, pushed open the door to the room on the right. The walls were painted light blue, and on the desk sat a box of colored pencils and a few brand new notebooks. She stepped inside, touched the wall, and whispered, "This color. It's the same as the sky I always draw." Daniel stood at the doorway, his gaze softening. "I guessed right, didn't I?" Next door, Noah's room was smaller, but a white crib stood by the window with a neatly folded blue blanket. When Daniel carried him inside, Noah burst into giggles, his little hand reaching for the curtain that swayed in the breeze. Grace bent down to adjust his pillow and whispered, "From now on, you won't have to sleep in the dark anymore." The next morning, Daniel wanted to make breakfast himself. He wasn't used to this, so when he put the bread into the toaster, he absent-mindedly glanced at the pot of boiling eggs. A sharp pop sounded, and smoke billowed into the kitchen. Grace ran downstairs, covering her nose, then burst into laughter when she saw him fumbling with the burnt black toast. "You're even worse than me when I first learned how to cook." Daniel looked embarrassed, set the cake down, and smiled awkwardly. "Yes, I suppose that's right. But at least I know how to order pizza." His words made Grace burst into laughter. That sound, echoing fully for the first time in the house, swept away the lingering gloom. That afternoon, Anna Collins came to visit. She brought a bag of toys, a few picture books, and a small wooden rocking horse. Placing the toy into Noah's hands, she said gently, "This used to belong to my son. Now I want Noah to have it." Noah clapped his hands and hugged the new toy tightly. Grace looked at Anna, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you. You're like a second mother to me." Anna's throat tightened, and she could only hug the girl tightly. "No, my dear. You are the reason people like me must believe that justice is real." Daniel stood behind them with his arms crossed, watching the two of them, his heart feeling lighter. He knew that without Anna, Rebecca, and Grace's own strength, he could never have made it this far. That evening, the Scarsdale sky was full of stars. Grace sat at her new desk, taking paper and colored pencils. She drew slowly, each line an attempt to hold on to the feelings inside her. When the drawing was finished, it showed three people standing together. A man, a little girl, and a baby, all looking up at the sky. She carried the drawing to Daniel. "I wanted Dad to be here too, but I think if he sees that I have you, he'll be happy." She hesitated, then spoke softly, as if deciding something important. "I know. I think from now on I'll call you Dad." Daniel froze, his heart tightening. That word, so simple yet so heavy. He didn't answer right away. He only bent down, hugged Grace, and nodded firmly. A single tear fell onto the paper, spreading slightly into the blue of the sky. Grace looked up, saw the trembling in his eyes, but also their certainty. At that moment, Rebecca Lawson stopped by. She carried the final documents for Daniel to sign, completing the legal process. As she stepped inside, she saw Daniel holding Noah, with Grace leaning against his shoulder. On the table sat the pie Anna had brought. Rebecca smiled. "I've never seen you look more like a father than you do right now." Daniel smiled softly and replied quietly, "I never thought I'd see a day like this." Rebecca placed the papers down and sat across from him. Family isn't only about blood, it's also about choice. And today, you made the right one. Late at night, the whole house lay in silence. Grace slept in her pale blue room, Noah resting in his crib. Daniel remained in the living room, a cup of cold coffee in his hand. The warm yellow light of the lamp fell across the wooden table. As he was about to stand, his eyes caught on a white envelope placed neatly there. It bore no name of a sender. Daniel frowned and opened it. Inside was only a scrap of paper with rough letters scrawled across it. "There are others who want this inheritance. Be careful." Daniel clenched the note in his hand, his expression darkening. He looked up toward the ceiling, where the two children slept peacefully, and let out a deep sigh. He knew his journey as a father had only just begun, but the shadows outside had not yet truly disappeared. A story may come to an end, but its echoes linger in our hearts for a long time. From the moment Grace was falsely accused over a single-dollar bill and cast out of her home under cold and merciless shouting, to the instant Daniel Carter stepped in, choosing to trust and protect her, we have witnessed a journey filled with tears, yet overflowing with hope. This story reminds us that in life, evil may prevail for a time, but justice and truth will always find their way. Victoria and Thomas, with their selfish and cruel schemes, ultimately could not escape the reach of the law. Laura Bennett, who aided in deceit, was forced to pay the price. And Evelyn Scott, the one who spread lies, had no choice but to bow her head in apology. That is the powerful message here. Wrongdoers will be punished, while the good will eventually be rewarded. But more important than anything else, this journey is proof of the power of love. Daniel, a businessman who once seemed to care only about contracts and numbers, learned how to be a father through the smallest of clumsy steps, mixing formula, soothing a crying baby, even burning toast in the morning. It was in those ordinary, imperfect moments that Grace and Noah's wounded hearts began to heal, and with them, Daniel's own scarred past. That is exactly what Story 4 Heart has always wished to share. Stories that warm the soul, stories that do more than entertain, stories that remind us love and justice are always present. Sometimes, all it takes is one person brave enough to stand up and say, "Enough," the way Daniel did. And now I want to ask you, after hearing this story, what do you think? Do you believe that even a single dollar can expose human greed and deceit? Have you ever witnessed a moment when good finally triumphed over evil? Share it with me in the comments. I truly want to hear your story. Today, I also want to reach out to you, our dear Story 4 Heart audience. Where are you watching this story from? Are you doing okay? I hope these moments have brought you a little peace, a little faith that no matter how hard things may be out there, something good is still waiting for us ahead. If you feel this story has touched your heart, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video so that more people can experience the power of compassion. Because sometimes, just a hug, just a simple phrase like, "I believe in you," or simply a heart that does not turn away from a child, is enough to change an entire life. And that is exactly why Story 4 Heart exists, to tell and listen to the most heartfelt stories together with you. The millionaire father returned from his business trip, and he froze in shock when he witnessed the scene before him. His little daughter, dressed in a filthy, tattered pink dress, was holding her 8-month-old baby brother in both arms. Her voice broke with sobs as she pleaded, "Please don't hurt me and my brother anymore." From that very moment, every secret hidden inside the house began to unfold. Samuel Walker sat in his cold office. At 43, he owned and worked from the top floor of Central Park Tower in New York, one of the most luxurious buildings at the heart of the city. On his desk rested a gold-plated pen and a thick stack of files. He signed each page like a machine, the crystal chandelier light glinting off the Rolex on his wrist. The tailored suit fit perfectly across his broad shoulders. The Italian leather shoes gleamed beneath the desk. Everything around him spoke of wealth, success, and power, the very things any American man might dream of. But inside, his heart was hollow. Samuel had once known a happy family. Sarah, his first wife, had been the light of his life. Emily, their first daughter, used to run around the yard with her soft brown hair bouncing in the wind. And now there was Michael, the baby boy only 8 months old, born in the middle of loss. The day Sarah left this world because of hemorrhaging after childbirth, Samuel felt as though his life had been drained away. 8 months had passed, and he had not once sat down to play with Emily, nor had he held Michael in his arms. He buried himself in business trips, paperwork, and numbers, as if running away from memory. During that time, Veronica, his second wife, appeared like an angel. Once Sarah's close friend, she had stepped into the house with a gentle presence, soothing everything broken with her sweet, radiant smile. To Samuel, she was the devoted woman he needed. If Sarah had been light, then Veronica was the salvation of his life. She held both children as if they were her own, caring for them with the tenderness of a model mother. Seeing that, Samuel felt reassured. He thought, at least the children have a woman at home. That is better than growing up with only a cold father. He was always grateful that she carried the burden he had abandoned. Today, after a month away on business, Samuel closed the last file. He stood, catching his reflection in the tall mirror on the wall, his face stern, his eyes weary. Suddenly, a thought crossed his mind. He wanted to go home early without telling anyone. He wanted to bring a small surprise. Maybe Emily would run into his arms. Maybe Michael would smile when he held him close. The thought softened him for the first time in months. Samuel took his coat and walked out quickly before his secretary could ask another question. The luxury car sped along the road leading back to his suburban estate. That house had once been filled with laughter, once warm with life. Now it was a place Samuel rarely touched, stopping only between trips. Today felt different. He wanted to see his family. The iron gates opened and Samuel stepped into the grand hall. Everything was unusually still. The golden glow of the chandelier fell across the marble floor. He set his briefcase down on the table and removed his coat. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, he heard the faint sound of a child's sobs. Michael. The sound pierced the silence. Samuel froze. Amid the weak cries, another trembling voice followed, small and broken. "Please, don't hurt me and my brother anymore." Samuel's body stiffened. It was Emily. His daughter's voice, choking, pleading. His whole body tensed, his heart seeming to stop. He moved forward slowly, following the hallway, and stopped just out of sight behind the frame of the doorway leading into the living room. The scene before him made it hard to breathe. Emily, 6 years old, her brown hair tangled, her pink dress stained with dirt, sat huddled on the floor, her small arms wrapped tightly around Michael. The baby's face was red, his cries relentless, his tiny hands reaching out and clinging to his sister. Emily bowed her head, her shoulders trembling. Standing across from them was Veronica. She wore a tight red dress, her blonde hair styled perfectly, her face heavily made up. But her voice was nothing like the sweetness she showed Samuel. It was sharp, each word cutting like glass. "Shut up. How many times have I told you, do not bother me? If you don't listen, I will throw both of you out on the street again." Samuel rushed forward, placing himself between Veronica and the children. "Stop." His voice was hoarse but firm. He reached out, trying to take Michael, his movements clumsy after so long without holding his son. "Let me hold him. Emily, come here to Daddy." The girl froze, her fingers gripping the edge of her dress. Samuel hesitated for half a beat, his hand hovering in the air before pulling back, standing protectively in front of them, by instinct alone. A flash of venom crossed Veronica's eyes, sharp as a needle. In an instant, it vanished behind a gentle smile. "You're back? I was just teaching the kids some discipline. They were being too wild." She stepped closer, placing a light hand on the sleeve of Samuel's jacket, her voice softening like honey. "You must be tired after coming home. Don't get so worked up over a moment of childish whining. The doctor said kids need discipline, didn't he?" I've been with them all month. I understand their behavior better. Samuel held Michael tightly, his throat burning. He glanced at Emily, saw the panic in her eyes, then back at Veronica's tender smile. She tilted her head, pressing her lips together as if with pity. Or maybe, you just feel guilty for being away too long so everything looks worse than it is? Don't weigh yourself down. Children look at the adults around them. The words slipped out soft as a breeze, but sharp as a blade. Samuel lowered his eyes, swallowing hard. He spoke slowly, struggling to keep calm. I don't want to hear crying like that in this house. Veronica seized the words, twisting them into her excuse. Exactly. That's why I'll handle it the gentlest way. Go take a shower, change, make yourself comfortable. Don't let the kids see us at odds. It's not good for their minds. As she finished, she cast a sidelong glance at Emily. A single faint smirk was enough to make the girl bow her head. A snake hidden beneath velvet, and Samuel saw it though he could not name it in time. He stood frozen. Half anger, half guilt tangled into a knot inside him. One painful, haunting question echoed in his mind. What did I just witness? Samuel took a deep breath, adjusted the child in his arms so he would not slip, then stepped into the living room as if everything were still normal. Veronica had already put on a gentle look, her voice warm but clearly forced. You came home early, you surprised me. I'll tell the kitchen to prepare dinner. Sit and rest. I'll take care of the rest. Samuel nodded. He glanced at Michael, who was still sobbing, his chest tightening with the feeling that he had missed something deeply important during the past 8 months. Veronica snapped her fingers lightly, and the housekeeper appeared in the kitchen doorway. It was Mrs. Whitman, an older woman who had worked for the family since the days when Sarah was alive. She was discreet, well-mannered, and spoke little. She bowed gently to Samuel, then returned inside to set the table. Dinner was quickly arranged. The yellow light reflected on the silver cutlery. The smell of chicken soup rose warmly, yet it could not drive away the cold inside Samuel. He sat at the head of the table, Veronica to his right, Emily across from him, and Michael in a small chair, his eyes still wet and unsettled. Eat, sweetheart, so you'll grow strong. Veronica spoke as she placed a piece of meat into Emily's bowl. Her voice was sweet as honey, her smile fixed in place, but the hand she laid on the girl's shoulder pressed a little too firmly. Samuel saw Emily's small shoulders flinch and the spoon in her hand tremble. He leaned slightly forward, observing more carefully. On Emily's left wrist were faint purple marks, stretched like fading bruises. Samuel's heart pounded, and he heard his own voice rise, slow and heavy. Emily, has anyone at school been bullying you? The girl startled. Her eyes flashed with fear before dropping quickly. Her voice was small, barely a whisper. No, Father. Veronica let out a soft laugh and turned to Samuel. Children bump into each other when they play. I keep reminding her to be careful. Samuel stayed silent, twirling the spoon in his hand. A wave of guilt ran down his spine, knowing that for months he had not been here to notice these little things. Suddenly, Michael kicked his legs. His lips curved downward, and a wail burst out into a long cry. Veronica stood, walked around to pick him up, her hand sliding under his arms but gripping too tightly. The movement was quick but without tenderness, and Michael screamed louder, his face flushed red. Give him to me. Samuel quickly stood, extending his arms, his voice hoarse and urgent. Veronica glanced at him briefly, then handed the boy over. Samuel awkwardly caught him, his arms stiff like wood after so long without holding his son. Emily lifted her head, her eyes filled with both surprise and hope. Samuel adjusted his hold, bringing the boy closer, rocking him gently. Michael kept crying, but his sobs grew less sharp, and Samuel's own breath slowed with each steady pat on the boy's back. You're safe now. Daddy's here, Samuel whispered. The words left his mouth, and he suddenly realized how long it had been since he last said something like that. Dinner dragged on slowly. Veronica kept starting conversations to fill the silence, bringing up a new investment portfolio, asking Samuel about his business trip, sometimes turning to Emily with a half-hearted question, as if to prove she cared. Mrs. Whitman stood quietly in the corner of the room, her hands clasped together. She did not interrupt once, but when Samuel caught her gaze, He saw in her eyes an unease she could not hide. He was about to call her over, but Veronica had already offered dessert, leaving his question caught in his chest. When the meal ended, Samuel set his napkin on the table and spoke calmly. "I'm going upstairs to change and look over some documents. Emily, make sure you brush your teeth after you finish eating." "Yes, Dad." Emily's reply was faint, her eyes flickering quickly before dimming again. Samuel pushed back his chair, lifted Michael, and handed the boy to Veronica. This time, he noticed her hand more closely, her thumb pressing into the child's side with a practiced reflex. Samuel pressed his lips together and said nothing. He turned away and walked toward the stairs, the wooden steps creaking softly under his feet. At the fourth step, he froze. He had heard the faint clinking of glasses, the scrape of a chair, and then Veronica's voice dropped low, sharp as a blade slicing through silk. "Listen carefully. Remember what I say. If you dare open your mouth to your father, I will throw you and your brother out on the street. I swear it." There was a pause, followed by the sound of quick, shallow breathing, surely Emily's, and then a strangled whisper. "Please, please don't." "I'll stay quiet. I won't say a word." Samuel stood paralyzed, his hand gripping the banister until his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded against his ribs as if trying to break free. His mind flashed with the images he had just seen Veronica's shifting voice. Sweet one moment, venomous the next. His daughter's terrified eyes, the bruises on her thin wrists. Michael's cries in arms that were not his own. Downstairs, Veronica's tone shifted again. She gave a thin laugh and spoke louder, just enough for her words to slip through the stairwell. "Good. Finish your food and then I'll give you dessert." Samuel still did not move. Sweat dampened his palms even though his body felt cold. He swallowed hard, but his throat stayed dry, as anger and guilt wrapped around him, squeezing until he could hardly breathe. Mrs. Whitman stepped softly out of the kitchen, her shoes making almost no sound. She paused, her eyes lifting briefly toward the staircase, as if she knew someone was there but dared not look directly. She placed a folded towel on the lower banister, a small, discreet gesture that felt like a message. Samuel bit hard on the inside of his cheek to steady himself. He knew he could not simply walk away as if nothing had happened. Yet he also understood that a single outburst now might frighten those trembling little hands even more. He tightened his grip on the railing, drew in a long breath, and forced the breaking wave inside him back down. And so, he remained there on that step, listening to the pounding of his own heart, the faint clatter of a spoon against a bowl, and the rise of a new and unmistakable command within him, a vow he could not delay even one more day. Samuel's hand still gripped the banister. He inhaled deeply, released it, then returned to the dining table and spoke a short sentence to bring dinner to an end. After that, he went into the study, closed the door, and stood in silence for a long time by the bookshelf. That night he did not sleep, only listening to the small footsteps of his children and the whispers echoing down the hallway like needles piercing skin. When the sky turned pale, he washed his face with cold water, adjusted his collar, and walked straight to the kitchen. Mrs. Whitman was placing dishes onto the wooden shelf. She was the elderly housekeeper who had lived in this home since the time Sarah was a young bride. She was quiet, meticulous, and always kept the proper boundaries. Hearing Samuel's steps, she froze, her thin, dry hands still holding the cloth. "How were the children while I was away?" Samuel asked. His voice was steady, but his eyes could not hide the exhaustion. She hesitated, looked down, then sighed. "Do you want the truth?" Samuel nodded. "I only want the truth." She set the cloth down, speaking slowly so as not to stumble over her emotions. Some nights Miss Veronica made the girls stand on the porch for a long time just for dropping a spoon. One night, I found her holding her little brother, sleeping in the storage room because their bedroom was locked. Many times Michael was given only very diluted milk. He cried from hunger until he fell asleep. I tried to intervene, but she told me I had no right to interfere with her way of raising them. Samuel felt his heart clench. The image of Sarah holding a bowl of porridge, lifting Emily onto the chair, smiling as she told a bedtime story came back like a blade cutting through memory. He swallowed, keeping his voice even. "Did you hear her make any threats?" "Yes." Her answer was soft, her eyes still fixed on the cloth. "She said if the girl ever told you, both children would be thrown out. She also threatened to fire me if I ever spoke of it. I truly am sorry, sir. She is far too cunning." Samuel shook his head, resting a hand on the back of a chair to keep it from trembling. "It is not your fault. From now on, if anything happens, you tell me directly. And, if necessary, would you be willing to testify?" She raised her eyes, and in them was a quiet resolve. "For the children, I am willing." That entire day, Samuel moved through the rooms as if inspecting an unfinished worksite. He called his office, postponed every meeting, excusing himself with family matters. He went into the children's room, opened the closet to check blankets, examined the bottles, and took notes in a tight, pressed script. Every small trace was like an accusation. Veronica smiled at him softly, inquiring about his work, but Samuel said little. He told her they would talk later and asked the kitchen to prepare a light dinner. He did not want to cause noise. He wanted to see clearly. The night fell very slowly. In the study, Samuel pushed the files aside until only the small frame of Sarah remained before him. He placed his hand on the wooden surface, an apology lodged in his throat. The desk lamp lit the lines at the corners of his eyes. Outside in the hallway, the wind whistled faintly through the crack of the door. Then came the sound of hesitant steps, stopping at the threshold. The door opened slightly. Emily stood there, holding Michael tightly as he dozed, her eyes swollen and red as if she had been crying for a long time. Samuel rose quietly, afraid of shattering the fragile shell wrapping his children. He took Michael into his arms, feeling how light the boy's body was and how uneven his breath came from exhaustion. The faint smell of watered-down milk clung to his collar. He motioned for Emily to sit, pulling a chair so they could be at eye level. But the girl still sat on the edge, her back stiff, her eyes flicking often toward the door. "Dad." The small call was barely a fragment of breath. Then it faded. Samuel nodded, as if to say there was no need to force out more words. He patted Michael's back in an even rhythm, catching the faint gurgle of the boy's stomach. Emily pulled her sleeve down to cover her wrist, her fingertips brushing the frayed hem of her dress, her legs drawing up at times when a distant sound stirred in the hallway. The air in the room was thick with pauses, as if every sentence wanted to rise, but then retreated again. Samuel handed her a cup of warm water. Emily received it with both hands, sipped a tiny swallow, her eyes still fixed on the outline of the doorframe as though expecting someone to walk in. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but stopped himself, afraid that even one misplaced word might make her retreat further. He chose instead a neutral phrase, light as placing a blanket over her shoulders. "Sit here where it's warm." The girl nodded, let out a short breath, then lowered her eyes. As her sleeve slipped back, a purple mark surfaced for a moment, and then vanished like a fish diving into dark water. Samuel saw it but pretended not to, his chest tightening with partial understanding and with the weight of not yet having enough proof to name the rest. Michael drifted into drowsy sleep, his small hand clinging to Samuel's collar as though it were the last anchor he had. Samuel stayed perfectly still, afraid that even the smallest movement might wake the fragile fears trying to lie quiet. "It's safe here." His voice was just above a whisper, its warmth carrying more than the words themselves. Emily gave a faint nod, her lips quivering as though she meant to speak, but then she fell silent. Outside, the wind slipped through the crack of the door in a thin line, rattling the key hook. The girl flinched, her hand curling back in a reflex born of long practice. Samuel reached out, intending to rest a light touch on her wrist as reassurance. Emily recoiled slightly, her chair creaking the softest sound. He froze instantly, his hand suspended in the air, then withdrew it as though from a flame. The silence thickened with another layer. Inside his chest, a question broke loose. When did the distance between father and daughter become this wide? My own child. Is she afraid of even my hand? Samuel stood still for a long time after Emily pulled her hand away. He drew in a deep breath, placed Michael back in the crib, and pulled the blanket over him. Emily sat curled up on the chair, hugging her knees, her eyes still swollen. Samuel bent down, speaking slowly so she could hear him clearly. "Sleep here tonight. I'll be right next to you." Emily nodded, her hands clasped tightly together. Samuel dimmed the light, closed the door to his study, and walked into the empty hallway. The silence of the night seemed to swallow every breath. He could not sleep. Images of Sarah and her warm smile rose again and again out of the darkness. He opened the door to his late wife's old room. A faint fragrance still lingered on the shawl that hung behind the door. Samuel opened the wardrobe and pulled out the small drawer where Sarah used to keep Emily's cards. A thin envelope slipped off the edge of the drawer, caught against the wooden rim. On the front was the handwriting he knew so well. To Samuel. He froze. His hand trembled as he opened the letter. The slanted handwriting seemed like Sarah's voice speaking to him. If I am no longer here, please protect Emily and Michael. Do not place your trust too quickly in anyone. Believe in your child's eyes. When she is afraid, she will not know how to lie. Samuel sank down onto the floor, the paper quivering with his breath. His mind filled with the sight of Emily clutching her little brother, her dress torn and filthy, her eyes wide with fear. Michael had felt so light in his arms, his breathing broken from hunger and exhaustion. A wave of grief surged through him, no longer a vague sense of guilt, but a sharp, searing ache of fatherly love that tightened his chest. He pressed the letter against his chest, closed his eyes, as if hearing Sarah's voice guiding him word by word. I am sorry, Sarah. From now on, I will protect our children. He opened his eyes, stood, folded the letter carefully, and tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket as though sealing a vow. His hand brushed the picture frame on the shelf. From that moment, the decision became simple. He would return to being a father in the truest sense. He held the letter against his chest for a long time, until the hallway light flickered faintly with the wind. When he finally rose, his back ached, but inside him a cord had tightened, pulling him straight forward. The next morning, Samuel woke early. He brewed coffee, listening to Mrs. Whitman's footsteps in the kitchen, the faint clink of a spoon. Veronica appeared soon after, neatly dressed, smiling, as usual. Did you sleep well? Today I'll take Emily to her music class. Let's have an early dinner tonight. Samuel gave a restrained smile. I have things to do at home. You keep to your schedule. He said nothing more. All day he remained calm, as if smoothing the last crease on a suit, yet his eyes never left Veronica's movements. By mid-afternoon, she received a call, lowering her voice. All right, 10 minutes, in the back garden. Samuel stood on the porch, a coffee cup in hand. He changed course, circling along the stone path, and stopped behind the row of poplars. The back lawn was still, without wind. A stranger entered through the side gate, a man in his 30s, wearing a dark coat, a thin bag slung over his shoulder. Veronica approached him, her smile no longer the gentle one she wore inside the house. Right on time, Caleb. The man shook her hand quickly. I only have 10 minutes. Are you sure about the authorization? Veronica lowered her voice. It's a large sum. I want to bring it in early. The trust is under Walker's name. If the signature is transferred, I'll gain control. Caleb glanced around, then pulled out a thin stack of papers. I need more proof you have the right. The marriage certificate is there, but the proxy signature for the family fund is still missing. Walker isn't a fool. Veronica gave a cold smile. Don't worry, he's busy playing the perfect father. As for the rest, I'll get it another way. Caleb folded the papers. No more than 2 weeks. After that, the plan will be harder. Thank you. Veronica touched his hand with a familiar gesture. Keep it quiet for me. Samuel stood behind the trees, his heart pounding heavily. He had heard enough to understand where the blade was pointing. It wasn't just the shouting in the kitchen, not just the threats on the stairs. This was a step across another line. Caleb left through the side gate. Veronica lingered a moment, adjusted her hair, then walked back into the house with a calm face. Samuel still didn't move. He opened his phone, the black screen reflecting his own face. 3 tasks lined up in his mind, as straight as ruled lines. Protect the children, preserve the evidence, and call an old friend who knew the law. He went back inside, passing through the living room. Emily was stacking wooden blocks for Michael, glancing now and then toward the kitchen. Her eyes flicked toward him, still carrying some caution, but there was also a small glimmer. Samuel paused for a second, laying his hand gently on his daughter's shoulder. You're here with me, Emily nodded, her lips forming a faint word. Yes. Samuel kept walking, his hand gripping Sarah's letter inside his jacket pocket. His heartbeat surged not from fear, but from a late awakening turning into action. He knew what he would have to face. And he understood something else, chilling in its simplicity. She isn't only mistreating my children, she is plotting for the inheritance too. Samuel tightened his grip on the letter in his pocket and walked straight toward the living room. He stopped beside the play rug, bent down to pick up a wooden block that had rolled away, and placed it in Emily's hand. His voice lowered to reassure her. "You stay here with Daddy." Emily gave a slight nod, her eyes darting toward the kitchen, as if to check whether anyone was listening. That night, Samuel stayed in the living room longer than usual. He sat beside them, opened a children's book that Sarah used to read to Emily years ago, and read slowly, letting each word linger. His other hand tapped a steady rhythm on Michael's back until the boy's breathing became calm and even. Every time footsteps passed by, Emily stiffened, her little hand clutching at the hem of her dress, her gaze shifting to the window as if searching for an escape. Seeing this, Samuel whispered, "It's all right. Daddy is here." Veronica passed by once. She smiled faintly and asked as though in passing, "It's late. Let me take the children to their room. They have school tomorrow." Samuel looked up, his tone deliberately calm. "I'll do it." Veronica shrugged and turned away, leaving behind a trace of perfume that could not mask the unease beneath her polished manner. Mrs. Whitman came carrying a warm glass of milk. She placed it on the table by the chair, her eyes glancing at the door before meeting Samuel's, as if to remind him not to let the children out of his sight. Samuel thanked her, urged Emily to take a few sips, then placed Michael in the portable crib, pulling it close beside his chair. He finished the page of the story in a steady, low voice. When the clock struck late, Samuel carried Michael and guided Emily toward the children's bedroom. The door stood ajar, the room tidy but cold. He straightened the blankets, laid the boy in the crib, pulled a small chair close for Emily to sit beside the bed, and spoke slowly. "Daddy is right here. Go to sleep." Emily nodded, but before closing her eyes, she still glanced outside as if waiting for some sound. Samuel dimmed the hallway light, stood at the doorway a while longer, then returned to his study, deciding to move his chair closer to the door so that with one glance, he could still see the faint light spilling from the children's room. Near midnight, Samuel lifted his head from the stack of papers when he heard a faint metallic clink at the end of the hallway. He rose quickly, following the sound, his heartbeat racing before he could steady himself. Someone had turned off the hallway light, leaving the space blurred in shadow. Samuel flicked the switch, and the sudden brightness made him squint. In front of the children's room, Emily was sitting hunched on the floor, clutching Michael tightly, the baby hastily wrapped in a thin blanket. Her eyes were red, her cheek pressed against her brother's forehead to keep him warm. The lock on the outside of the door clicked just as it released, and Samuel understood at once. "Who left you out here?" Samuel asked, his voice hoarse with anger, though he managed to restrain it. She locked the room," Emily whispered, each word catching in her throat as her arms tightened protectively around her brother. Samuel knelt, gathered them both, holding Michael firmly against his chest while lifting Emily up with his other arm. "Come with Daddy." He carried the children back to his room, pushed the door until it met the frame, and locked it softly, moving slowly so as not to startle them. Samuel laid Michael in the middle of the bed, propped soft pillows around him, and pulled the blanket to his chest. He slid a chair close for Emily beside the edge of the bed, then poured the rest of the warm milk into a small cup. "Drink a little before you sleep. You're tired already." Emily clutched the cup with both hands, her lips pressed tight to hold back a sob, her eyes fixed on her father's mouth as if waiting for a clear promise. Samuel sat down on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on the blanket covering his daughter's legs. He did not touch her skin for fear she might flinch, but he left the warmth of his hand there like an invisible thread connecting them. "I'm here. Tonight you'll sleep in my room." In the softened glow of the night lamp, Emily looked up, her gaze lingering on the face of the man who had only appeared in brief flashes over the past 8 months between work trips. Her voice trembled, breaking at the end of the sentence. "Dad, are you going to abandon us like my stepmother said?" Samuel froze, his breath caught in his chest. Words, so natural before, now vanished. For a long moment, he could only pull the little girl closer and hold her against him. His chin rested on the crown of her head, the familiar scent of milk and child sweat burning his eyes. He did not know how to answer without sounding late without sounding false. He only repeated the one thing he could be certain of. "I'm here." Emily gave the faintest nod, her small hand gripping the hem of his shirt like holding onto a piece of driftwood. Michael stirred, let out a faint murmur, and drifted back into sleep. Samuel stayed still, listening to the breaths of the two children blending together, his own heartbeat slowing and heavy, like a silent promise being signed again in the dark. From the hallway came the sound of footsteps, stopping right outside the bedroom door. Samuel tensed instinctively, his arm tightening protectively around Emily's shoulders. Through the crack in the door came Veronica's voice, smooth as silk yet cold as thin steel. "I think we need to talk, Samuel." Samuel gently squeezed Emily's shoulder to reassure her, then set her down on the bed and pulled the blanket up for Michael. He stood, opened the door just enough for Veronica to see him. "The kids are asleep. Whatever it is, we'll talk in the morning." Veronica smiled, stepped back, her voice still soft. "As you wish." The door closed. Samuel sat down in the chair, pulled out his phone, and dialed a familiar number. "Richard, come by my house tomorrow evening. There's something in the portfolio we need to discuss." On the other end, the man answered briefly. "All right, 7 o'clock. Richard Coleman was a corporate attorney in his 40s, discreet and straightforward. He had been with Samuel since his earliest deals, understood how Samuel thought, and could read details most people overlooked. He wasn't only skilled with contracts, but also deeply knowledgeable about family trusts and asset protection, which was why Samuel believed Richard's presence would be far more valuable than a polite dinner. The next evening, Veronica took charge of the kitchen. She chose a white tablecloth, arranged red roses, and set gleaming silverware in place. When Richard arrived, Veronica came out to greet him with just the right smile, carrying the poise of a perfect hostess. "Such a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Coleman. Please, come in." Richard shook Samuel's hand, his gaze sweeping the room before stopping at the corner where Emily was holding Michael. He nodded to the children with a warm smile. Dinner began with soup. Veronica was attentive to every gesture in front of the guest. She placed the tenderest piece of meat into Emily's bowl, bent down to wipe a trace of milk from Michael's lip, and spoke with honeyed sweetness. "Eat up, darling, so you'll grow strong." Emily replied softly, "Yes, ma'am," then tried to lift a small spoonful. Samuel glanced over. On his daughter's shoulder, Veronica's hand seemed casually placed, but her fingers pressed down hard enough to make the fragile muscle tighten. Emily's face tensed. The spoon trembled. Samuel kept his expression calm, as if he hadn't noticed, but a burning heat rose in his chest. Richard filled the silence with business talk. "I reviewed the infrastructure fund update. The allocation is leaning too heavily toward bonds." "How long are you planning to stay defensive?" Samuel answered briefly, while setting his hand on the table as a signal. "I need to review the structure of the family trust. I'll have you look it over." Veronica's eyes flicked quickly, then she smiled again. "Mr. Coleman, you're always so thoughtful, always keeping the family's security in mind." When the main course was served, Richard turned to ask the chef about the sauce. He looked away for just a moment. Veronica leaned close to Emily's ear, her voice as thin as a blade. "Remember this, if you so much as whisper a word, your little brother will pay the price." Emily froze, lowered her spoon, her eyes downcast. From that moment on, she ate no more. She sat silently, her hands tucked under the table to cover her wrist, still marked with old bruises. Samuel noticed the motion. He lifted his glass of water, concealed a long, steady breath, and set it down firmly in its place, as if placing a small period on the decision he had just made. After dinner, Veronica poured tea. "I'll take the children upstairs first." She bent down, picked up Michael, and smoothed Emily's hair in front of the guests. "Come on, sweetheart." Emily stood up. Before leaving, the girl glanced at Samuel for a second, her eyes waiting as if asking whether it was safe. Samuel gave a small nod. "Go on, I'll be up later." The living room was left with just the two men. Richard set his teacup down, leaning back slightly into the chair. He talked a bit more about the fund, then lowered his voice. "You want me to review the trust structure, don't you?" Samuel answered shortly. "Yes, and also the power of representation." Richard nodded. "All right, But let me ask you this." He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Samuel. "Since the moment I walked into this house, I saw a child flinch his shoulders in reflex from pain, an infant being held the wrong way, and a lady of the house controlling every glance. Did you call me for money or for something else?" Samuel stayed silent for a few seconds. He placed 2 fingers on the edge of the table to keep rhythm, then spoke slowly. "Both, but the latter matters more." Richard didn't rush. He pulled a small notebook from his briefcase and opened to a blank page. "Then let's begin with the truth. Tell me what you've seen, what you've heard, and who you want to protect." Samuel recounted in short fragments, without adding or omitting. The words on the staircase, the lock on the outside of the bedroom door, the bruises, and the threat just now. Richard jotted down a few key words, never interrupting, only nodding when needed. Veronica returned, smiling at the 2 men. "Do you need anything else?" Richard replied politely. "Thank you. The tea was very good." She closed the door behind her. He waited a beat before continuing, lowering his voice further. "My friend, I'm afraid your second wife is hiding much more than she lets on, and I can help you uncover the truth." Samuel looked straight at his friend. In his eyes, the burning anger had settled into a cold determination. "Where should we begin?" Richard left around 9 o'clock. Samuel walked him to the door, kept his hand on the knob for a moment to steady his breath, then turned back into the house. He opened the children's room door slightly, saw Emily and Michael already asleep, pulled the blanket up to his daughter's shoulders, and placed the teddy bear back beside her. Then he closed the door and went straight down to the living room. Veronica was pouring wine, the crystal glass casting a dark red reflection. "I need to talk to you right now." Samuel stood across from her, his voice low and firm. "Emily has a bruise. Explain it to me." Veronica set the glass down, the corner of her lips lifting. "Are you accusing me? I spend the whole day here with the kids. Did you see me cooking, bathing them, watching when they cried?" She grabbed the glass again and slammed it down hard on the table. The stem cracked with a sharp sound, the wine splashing across the surface. "I'll ask again." Samuel did not look away. "What did you do to my child?" Veronica let out a dry laugh. "Do you really think I want to take care of Sarah's children? Can't you see from beginning to end? You never chose me. You only chose her shadow." Samuel froze for a moment. He placed 2 fingers on the table to steady his rhythm. "Stay on point. Answer why the girl has a bruise. Children fall." Veronica folded her arms. "Besides, she's stubborn. She needs to learn to obey. I teach her the way a mother teaches a child." "A mother?" Samuel tilted his head. "Are you talking about Sarah? She taught them by holding them and speaking with them, not by locking doors and threatening." For a brief second, Veronica's face shifted, then turned cold. She leaned forward, her voice cutting. "Sarah, always perfect, gentle, intelligent. Everyone adored her. And me? I was nothing but her shadow. Did you marry me out of pity, or because Sarah asked you before she died?" Samuel kept silent for a few seconds, letting the weight of the truth settle. He spoke slowly, each word striking with precision. "I married you because I thought the children needed a woman in the house. I was wrong, and tonight I corrected." Veronica burst into laughter, her voice thick with resentment. "Corrected? How? By throwing me out? Do you think the court will believe you? You were away for a month on business. Who cared for the children? Me. Who fed the baby his milk? Me. And where were you? Hiding in your gilded office." Samuel did not back down. "You know why I called the lawyer here tonight. You know what I saw. And you also know what I heard." Veronica slammed her hand on the table. "Fine. Then listen closely." She spat out each word, her eyes blazing as if they were about to shatter. "I hate her, and I hate those 2 children who carry Sarah's face even more. Every time I look at them, I feel like I've lost. I was by your side when you collapsed, while she lay cold on a metal table. But you never once looked at me as the one you chose. Never." Samuel exhaled, long and pained. "You're right about one thing. I didn't choose anyone. I only ran from grief. But from tonight on, I choose to stand with those children. I won't let anyone hurt them. Not even you." Veronica tilted her head, her smile stretching like a cut across her face. You think you can take everything back? You forget. I am the legal wife. I have rights in this house, in this trust. If you want to fight, I'm ready. Tomorrow, Samuel said, his voice flat and cold. I'll meet with the lawyer about the trust and guardianship. I'll also speak with the police about abuse if necessary. You should prepare yourself. You wouldn't dare, Veronica sneered. You'll humiliate yourself in court. People will say Samuel Walker couldn't keep his wife, couldn't keep his house, couldn't keep his children. Can you live with that? I can live with their words. Samuel lifted the napkin and set it down neatly, as if signing something in silence. What I cannot live with is the sound of my children crying. Veronica faltered for half a beat, then flared again. Then just wait and see who ends up thrown out of this house. A soft creak of wood on the stairs made them both turn. On the landing, Emily stood pressed against the banister, clutching her teddy bear. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. The small hand slid across the bear's fur, and the toy nearly tumbled down the steps. Emily bent to grab it, her hands trembling so badly that even when she hugged it tight, it still slipped. Samuel took a step toward the stairs, his hand lifting on instinct. Veronica's smile sharpened into something cruel. Neither of them said another word. The air froze around the ragged breaths of a child trying not to cry. Samuel managed to catch the teddy bear, placed it back into Emily's hands, and whispered for her to return to her room. He closed the door, leaned against it for a few seconds to steady his breathing, then dialed Richard's number. We start the process tomorrow morning. On the other end, Richard gave only a short reply. See you at Lincoln, 9 o'clock. The next morning, the family court hallway in Lincoln smelled of paper and weak coffee. Richard Coleman walked beside Samuel, holding a thick file that already included Mrs. Whitman's statement and photos of the bruises. Emily clutched Samuel's hand, while Michael had been left with a court-appointed babysitter outside the courtroom. Veronica arrived with a man in a dark blue suit, her attorney, named Alan Pierce. She wore light makeup, held a tissue, and her eyes glistened just enough in the right places. Case number 14 Farad, the clerk called out. Walker petitioning for emergency protection for minors. All four walked in, all rise. The guard's voice was steady. Judge Eleanor Myers sat above them. She was about 50, with bright eyes, a woman who spoke little but observed much. Richard began. Your Honor, we request an emergency protection order and restrictions on contact for the respondent, Veronica Hayes, on the basis of emotional abuse and neglect. We have the housekeeper's testimony, photographs of the injuries, and a letter from the plaintiff's late wife as context. Alan lifted his chin, cutting in immediately. Your Honor, my client is a devoted stepmother. These accusations are speculation. There is no direct evidence. Veronica dabbed at the corner of her eye. The girl is sensitive, Your Honor. I only disciplined her as any mother would. The judge nodded. Call the witness. Mrs. Whitman stepped up to the stand, her hands clasped together. Richard asked concisely, What did you see? I saw the girl repeatedly forced to stand outside on the porch. One night, she had to sleep in the storage room with her brother because her bedroom door was locked. The boy was often given only watered-down milk. I heard Mrs. Veronica threaten to throw them out if the girl told her father. Richard asked, You are certain it was the respondent's voice? Yes. I was 2 meters away. Alan approached, his tone flat. How old are you? 62. Could your memory have been mistaken in a dark hallway? Number. Her answer was short. I worked in that house for 10 years. I do not mistake her voice. Alan raised his brow. Do you have any personal grudge against my client? Number. I am only afraid for the children. Richard presented a stack of photographs. Photographs of bruises on Emily's left wrist, taken 2 days ago, time-stamped. The judge examined them carefully, tilting her head slightly. Alan quickly countered. Children run. They fall. Injuries are normal. The photos don't prove who caused them. Veronica lowered her face, sobbing at just the right rhythm. I did my best. He was gone for months on business trips. Everything fell on me. Samuel stood upright, his hands clasped together to steady his trembling. Richard moved on to the letter. This is a letter Mrs. Sarah Walker left behind. It is not behavioral evidence, but it provides context about the family and her instruction to protect the children. The letter was handed up. The judge read a portion, paused for a few seconds, then set it down. The court acknowledges it. The courtroom was tense, like a drawn string. The judge glanced from one side to the other. The court requires more direct evidence. Can the child speak? Richard looked at Samuel, as if asking for permission. Samuel leaned down, whispering to Emily, "You don't have to say anything if you're afraid. I'm right here." Emily looked at the high chair where the judge sat, then at her father's open hand waiting for her. She took a short breath. I want to speak." Emily stepped up to the witness stand. Her shoes tapped softly against the wooden edge. The clerk asked her name and age. Emily answered in a small voice. "My name is Emily Walker, 6 years old." The judge nodded slightly, lowering her tone. "You only need to tell the truth." Emily looked down at her hands, then raised her head, this time staring straight ahead. She said if I told my dad, she would throw me and my brother out onto the street. But I can't stay silent anymore. I don't want my little brother to grow up in fear. Her voice cracked on the last word, but she did not cry. From the bench below, Samuel lifted a hand to cover his eyes, his breath escaping in a short sob. Richard set his pen down, not writing another word. The room was silent. Judge Myers leaned back in her chair, her fingers interlaced. She looked at Veronica, then at Alan. She looked at Samuel, and then back to Emily. "Thank you, child." Alan tried to recover. "Your Honor, a child's words can be influenced." The judge raised her hand. "That's enough." She turned to the clerk. "Bring me the photographs again, and summon the child protection officer waiting in the hallway to come in after the session." Then she lowered her voice to Emily. "Would you like to sit with the clerk for a while?" Emily nodded, stepped down, passed by Samuel, and paused for half a second. Samuel squeezed her hand gently. The air had just begun to loosen when Veronica's chair suddenly screeched back. She shot to her feet, pointing toward the witness stand, her voice bursting out like a lid blown off. "Liar, you're just like your mother, always pretending to be so saintly." Veronica's scream was still trembling in the courtroom when the bailiff stepped forward quickly, placing his hand out to stop her from advancing further. Judge Myers struck the gavel 3 times, his voice sharp and decisive. "Order. The defendant will sit down immediately." Veronica let out a harsh laugh, but her shoulders had stiffened. Alan tugged at her sleeve, whispering a few words in an attempt to suppress the fire that had just flared up. Richard leaned forward to shield Emily from the sight. Samuel placed the flat of his hand on his daughter's back, calming her with the gentlest touch. The judge glanced over the file once more, then raised his eyes. Based on the testimony, the photographs of the injuries, the contextual letter, along with the threatening behavior directed at a minor, the court issues an emergency protective order. The defendant, Veronica Hayes, is hereby suspended from all custody and visitation rights until a final ruling is made. Temporary custody is granted to the plaintiff, Samuel Walker. Furthermore, the court refers this case to the district attorney's office for investigation into child abuse and fraudulent conduct concerning the family trust assets. At the clerk's instruction, Carla Reyes, a social worker from the Department of Child Services, entered the room. She was about 35 years old, her voice steady, a professional who had handled many similar cases before. She bowed to the judge, then turned to Samuel. "I will coordinate to ensure safety starting right now." Emily clung even tighter to Samuel's hand. He nodded, his eyes moist. The judge paused briefly, fixing his gaze directly on Veronica. The court also notes the defendant's insulting and threatening behavior toward a child inside this courtroom. The defendant is held in contempt of court and remanded to custody for 24 hours. Veronica's eyes bulged. Alan leaned closer, lowering his voice in a desperate plea, but the bailiff had already motioned for her to follow procedure. The gavel fell one final time. This temporary hearing is adjourned. Samuel bent down and held Emily tightly. The little girl buried her face against his shoulder, the stuffed bear wedged between her small arms. He wrapped another arm around Michael when Carla brought the boy closer, as if afraid that even the smallest gap might let the cold wind seep in. Tears poured down his face before he could wipe them away. Richard placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, silent. Outside the courthouse, the hallway exploded with the sound of camera shutters and urgent questions. A young reporter from the local station, Jenna Price, held out her microphone. "Mr. Walker, do you have anything you'd like to say to the public?" Richard stepped half a pace forward, raising his arm to shield them. "Make way, please. We are protecting the children's privacy." Samuel only bowed his head, pressing Emily and Michael close against his chest, carrying all three of them through the flood of lights as though walking through a heavy rain. Behind them, Veronica was led out through a different passage, but when she saw Samuel, she jerked violently, her voice hissing through clenched teeth. "You took everything from me. But remember this, Samuel, one day you'll pay for it." Samuel stopped for half a beat. He didn't answer. He pulled Emily closer, one hand steadying Michael's back, his head bent slightly as if shielding them beneath an invisible umbrella. The gesture itself spoke louder than any words. No one will ever touch them again. Richard leaned close to Samuel's ear and whispered, "Go home right away. I'll continue working with the prosecutor and CPS. There will be patrols around your house tonight." Carla nodded. "I'll come by to check the home environment, mostly so Emily can see that the adults are standing on her side." As they walked to the car, Jenna called out one last time, but her voice softened into a blessing. "Good luck to the three of you." Samuel turned his head and gave a small nod. Emily clutched her stuffed bear tightly, her eyes looking out the window, her breathing calmer now. Night fell quickly over the courthouse parking lot. In the back corridor, the metal door shut with a dry, sharp click. Veronica sat inside a small holding cell, the white light glaring down on a face drained pale with rage. Her hand clutched the bars so tightly her knuckles turned white. The sound of the guard's boots faded away. The room was left with nothing but her heavy breathing and the smell of cold steel. She lifted her head, staring into the darkness between the bars, whispering to herself as if swallowing the bitterness of her defeat. "Sarah, in the end, you still won. But just wait. I swear, once I'm out of this place, I won't leave your husband and children in peace." The steel door closed behind Veronica. Samuel pulled the coat around Emily and took Michael from the social worker's arms. He signed the transfer papers with Carla Reyes, listening as she gave a few reminders about home visits and the children's therapy schedule. Samuel nodded, said thank you, then carried Michael to the car, gripping Emily's hand as if the wind could sweep her away. That night he mixed the milk, told stories, and soothed the children to sleep. The next morning, he called Richard to begin the long legal process. Life carried on like that, one day after another, built on small but steady acts. 2 years later, the sky looked clearer. Emily had grown taller, her hair tied up, her hand guiding Michael as he toddled along the brick path in the backyard garden. A small wooden sign hung on the fence, painted in white letters, "Mama Sarah's Garden." Tomato plants stretched up in green rows, crowned with yellow blossoms. Emily bent down to show her brother how to rest his hand on the stem without breaking it, her voice bright with excitement. "Daddy, look at this. Michael and I are growing tomatoes for you." Samuel sat back in the wooden chair, resting his notebook on his lap. He watched the children, saw in Emily the shape of an older sister who knew she was loved and was learning how to love in return. Michael stumbled forward, his tiny shoes smeared with soil, his face lifted in a wide smile. Samuel's lips curved into a gentle grin. Deep inside, he whispered a line meant only for the one no longer there. "Sarah, I did it. I kept my promise." Carla Reyes appeared at the back gate, a folder in her hand. She was still assigned to the family's case, though now the visits were only routine. Carla smiled, waved, and said, "I brought the certificate confirming the therapy program is complete. Emily is making great progress, and Michael is developing normally." Samuel rose to his feet and shook her hand. "Thank you for everything." Carla nodded. "Thank you for staying." After Carla left, Emily ran over carrying a basket of seedlings. She dropped onto the bench beside Samuel. "Daddy, can you help me with the stakes? I didn't tie them tight enough." Samuel held the twine, showing her carefully as he explained. "Wrap it like this, snug enough to hold but loose enough for the plant to breathe." Michael lingered nearby, every so often pressing a stone into his father's hand as though it were a gift. Samuel slipped each one into his pocket, not missing a single piece. A while later, Emily set the basket down and leaned her head against her father's shoulder. The scent of sun and soil clung to her hair, the truest perfume he had ever known. Samuel remembered the first hearing, when those small shoulders trembled with fear. Now they were steady. He asked softly, "How is school?" Emily smiled. "Rosie asked me to be team leader. I told her about the garden, and she loved the story." Samuel nodded. "Tonight I'll make pasta with the first ripe tomatoes. You'll be my sous chef." Emily laughed. "Yes, Daddy." The back door opened, and Mrs. Whitman carried out a plate of butter cookies, the aroma clear in the air. She set it down on the small table, her eyes wrinkling with joy as she looked at the two children. "Have some milk, kids." She turned to Samuel. "There's a letter from Attorney Richard. He sent the schedule for the final hearing to confirm permanent custody." Samuel took the paper, scanned it quickly, and felt as if a heavy stone had finally settled firmly in place. He said, "This afternoon, after your nap, we'll stop by Uncle Richard's office, then go out for ice cream." Michael's head shot up at the word ice cream. Ice cream. Samuel lifted him into his arms, pretending to think. "What flavor will it be?" Michael laughed loudly. "Strawberry," Emily chimed in. "I'll choose vanilla for you, Dad, because you said vanilla goes best with Mrs. Whitman's cookies." Samuel looked at the housekeeper, and the three of them burst out laughing. That afternoon, they stopped by Richard's office. The man shook each of their hands, patted Michael's head, and handed Emily a star-shaped paperclip. "It's done," he said simply. "The rest is just living well." On the way back, Emily held the clip like a treasure, occasionally lifting it to the window so the sunlight could shine through. When they returned to the garden, the day was already fading. Samuel washed his hands and went into the kitchen. Emily stood beside him rinsing tomatoes, while Michael counted strands of pasta by laying them one by one on the table like pieces of a railroad track. Samuel lit the stove, stirred garlic in the pan, and every so often glanced at his children, seeing in that picture a steady rhythm of life he once thought he could never reach again. When dinner was ready, Emily clasped her hands behind her back, cleared her throat like a tiny announcer, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the chef proudly presents Walker family pasta with tomato sauce from Mom Sarah's garden." Michael clapped. Samuel laughed heartily. "I invite our two distinguished guests to enjoy the meal." After dinner, Emily ran around the garden, then suddenly stopped, turned back, and hugged him tightly. "Dad, now we're really a family, aren't we?" Samuel lifted her onto a chair, wrapped his arms around her, and answered firmly, "Yes, and it will always be that way." Michael hugged their legs, trying to squeeze into the family embrace. Samuel gathered both children into his arms and leaned back in the chair. Night fell, but the garden stayed warm with their presence. The shadows of the three overlapped on the grass, forming one solid shape. In the corner, tomato stakes stood upright, the twine holding them just enough without choking, the way Samuel had learned to hold his family together. He looked up at the wooden sign and brushed his fingertips across Sarah's name. In that quiet moment, Samuel realized he was no longer afraid of courtrooms, flashing cameras, or empty threats. What he held now was his children's laughter, their peaceful sleep, and the steady heartbeat of a true home. Those things were not loud, but they endured. Emily yawned and nestled her head against his shoulder. Michael dozed off with a tiny green tomato still in his hand. Samuel carried them both inside, turned off the lights one by one, checked the locks, and stopped by the children's room once more. He stood at the doorway, listening to their steady breathing, then stepped back and closed the door with a gentle touch. Outside, the night breeze brushed against the fence, carrying the scent of young tomato leaves. Inside, Sarah's photograph on the shelf seemed like a quiet blessing of peace. The story closes with the image of a father and his two children in a lush green garden, with a simple yet profound confirmation. When an adult chooses to stop and listen, a child can escape the shadows. That is the simple but powerful message. The wicked will be punished, the good will be rewarded, and justice must be built upon truth, courage, and unconditional love. Samuel was not perfect, but he returned at the right time, stood up to protect Emily and Michael, and made amends through his actions every single day. We too can do the same for the children around us. What do you think about Emily's journey from silence to speaking out? Which part touched you the most? The whispered words, "Please don't hurt me and my brother anymore." Sarah's letter, or the moment Samuel said, "I'm here." If it were you, what would you do when you noticed even the smallest signal of a child crying for help? Share your thoughts so we can talk together and spread the meaning of this story. I also want to ask how you are doing. Are you watching from somewhere far away, late at night, or maybe in the middle of a busy day? If today has been exhausting, I hope this story gives you a moment of peace. Don't forget to drink some water, rest your eyes, and hug your loved ones if you can. If you believe in heartwarming stories and emotional stories that can lift people up, share this video so that someone else might find strength too. Would you like me to continue telling more journeys of healing, or dive deeper into one of the characters in this story? Leave me a comment and let me know. Thank you for being here, for listening with your whole heart. We will meet again